Beethoven's very first published sonata in F minor, Opus 2, number 1. It is a fascinating, laconic and slightly enigmatic work. Fascinating particularly in the kind of insight it allows us into the first steps of what was to become perhaps the greatest cycle of sonatas in history. Beethoven wrote the three sonatas in 1795 and published them in 1796, quite a few years after he had already been living in Vienna and quite a few years after he had already conquered the city as a keyboard player and improviser. In fact, he was widely acknowledged to be one of the, if not the greatest pianist of his time. But recognition as a composer, that did not come as quickly or easily to him, and perhaps that's one of the reasons why he took such care in selecting the first opuses for publication. I should say that these three sonatas and the three trios opus 1, they were not the first works he had written or indeed published, but they were the first works which he gave an opus number to, so he really saw them as the first steps of his musical legacy. The three sonatas opus 2 were dedicated to Joseph Haydn, and that's a relationship worth talking about. Beethoven came to Vienna in order to study with Haydn. Haydn, one of the greatest stars on Vienna's firmament at the time, star as a composer and height of his creative powers. The relationship between the two was not easy, as one could imagine, knowing the very different characters of these two geniuses, and it came to a kind of rupture around the three trios opus 1, which Haydn heard. He loved number 1 and 2, which were more conventional, but number 3, which was the most Beethovenian, the darkest, the most passionate, the one full of outbursts, that one he was startled by and said that perhaps he would not have advised Beethoven to publish it. For Beethoven, that kind of criticism was completely unacceptable. He saw it even as a kind of envy on Haydn's side, which probably was not the case. But in any case, that came to a break between the two. And then when Haydn demanded that the three sonatas be not just dedicated to him, but be subtitled with a line composed by a student of Haydn, Beethoven grumbled, saying that he had learned nothing from Haydn and just wrote a simple dedication. Well, that kind of relationship. But indeed, the difference in writing and the difference in world building, musical world building between the two geniuses is already quite great. If we look at the three sonatas, they are all in 4 movements. That was a kind of symphonic form building. Sonatas usually were in 3 movements, fast, slow, fast. Beethoven added to these 3 movements either a minuet or a scherzo, depending on in which sonata. He wanted them perhaps to be more symphonic in nature, more large in scope. We can see it not just in the 4th movement added to the sonata, but also in the kind of writing. He loves thick textures. He loves doubling the melody in octaves as if 2 violins were playing it in a distance of 1 octave. So of course it is still very pianistic, but there is some kind of imagination at work which wanted already then to transcend the limitations of the instrument. We see it later on, especially in the last movement. The keyboard which he had at the time was from this F to this F. And he found already then, he found this extremely limiting. And we'll see in the finale how he tries to get over this F. He's constantly at the higher F. They're angry, loud, fortissimo chords, hitting many, many times, as if he wanted to try to break through this barrier of the wooden edge of the instrument, which was just there. This is something in contrast with Mozart's music, for example, which sits very comfortably within this range. This is not to say that Mozart didn't need more notes, but he found that he could express everything that he wanted expressed on the keyboard within this range. Whereas with Beethoven, from the very earliest works, like in this sonata, we find that this range is not enough. He's constantly at the edges. Interestingly, as a small aside, Throughout his life, he kept asking piano builders for more notes. And he got them. Throughout the next years, piano builders gave him a whole octave on the upper edge of the keyboard. So it went from this F to C and then finally to this F. And much later on, when he was already 47, an English piano builder, Thomas Broadwood, sent him a piano which also had extra notes on the bottom, going from this F to this C. So it got from this range to this range. And even then, he was always at the edges. Like, even that range was not enough. He would always write at the edge of the keyboard, to such an extent that you can often trace the exact number of notes he got in the latest iteration of the piano by the highest note he used at any point in a piano sonata or concerto. But enough about the future. Going back to the sonata itself. A few things we note already in the first page. First, the quite dark color of the music. But also the hysterical dynamic range which he passes from piano here to the fortissimo here. And he arrives at it with the kind of insistence which we'll find in so many of his works. He tries once, twice, and finally manages to reach the climax. But this kind of passing from piano to fortissimo within 7 bars, that was absolutely extreme. This was really not standard kind of composition. And the use of sforzandi here, also sforzandi usually would be special effects, but here to have them right from the beginning in the 5th bar. So on one hand we have a kind of very laconic expression. The entire exposition is less than 2 pages long, so it's not expansive writing, but emotionally, even though it feels constrained, it is still extremely strong and powerful. There's a whole boiling pot of emotion underneath the surface. This idea of saying things thrice, once, twice, and the third being the biggest one, he uses it a few times also later on. Once, twice, and third time. This is always that the third time is the most, whatever it is, it's the loudest or the most expressive one. Here, for example, at the end of the exposition, again, once, twice, and the third time it's an octave higher and also goes to a fortissimo. The development is all built on this part of the motive, which was effectively our second subject. Once again, piano and the small explosion. So this descending motive is what builds most of the development. First, in the same way as in the exposition, above a tremolo bass. Then in a different key. Then it becomes a kind of dialogue. It goes to the left hand. Now there will be a kind of dialogue between the hands. But this being Beethoven, it's not just nice and harmonic. There are sforzandi on the offbeats. this idea of sforzandi to accentuate the syncopated beats. This is pure Beethoven. This is we'll find from his music from Opus 1 until the very, very last. And sforzandi also for emphasis. Here. So it is again the weak beat. So it's not, but. And if you notice, this is exactly this high F which I was talking about. So he reaches the highest point and he hammers at it. Then a very interesting atmospheric transition to the reprise. It's quite poignant dissonance. And very interestingly, the first theme in the beginning is piano. It's quite reserved, poised, but we saw all these emotions bubbling underneath, and here in the reprise they burst out. So instead of these three chords, here it's much more decisive. It's just one chord on the downbeat. Also, in the exposition, it went from fortissimo to piano. So there, the explosion was still contained. Here, it goes on in fortissimo. And the very end of the first movement is even more dramatic. So first we have our 3 times repeated motive. Once. And for the third time, instead of finishing, there's a coda. Fortissimo. And now, once again, sforzandi on the offbeats. So decisive, quiet, not reserved, but as if almost saying there is nothing to be done about it. This is how things are. It is a short movement, and it is interesting to see what happens later in the sonata, because in retrospect, I would see this sonata almost as a progression for the old world. I don't know if connected to Haydn and Mozart, but something which is still at least slightly rooted in the past. And by the time we get to the finale, everything is unshackled, unhinged, and Beethoven comes into his full strength, full creative power. But before we reach the finale, there are 2 very interesting movements. The F major adagio, several interesting things here. First, for me, discovering this sonata, it was the realization that Beethoven from the very earliest age was in the search for poetic beauty. This is not something that we often or immediately associate with Beethoven. If we think of Beethoven from the portraits and the bust, the grumpy, angry man with wild hair, we don't think of Beethoven as someone who was deeply inside him a poet, but he was. And when we go through the entire cycle, the poetry, the lyricism and the beauty, in a way they are as strongly present and as commonplace in the cycle as the drama, darkness and passion, which is what we usually associate Beethoven with. I'll show a few moments later on of real exquisite beauty in the second movement. But another very interesting thing to note, that this passage was taken almost note by note from an earlier work of his. At the age of 14, he wrote 3 piano quartets, a quartet for piano and 3 string instruments. He never published them. They exist. We have the scores. They've even been recorded in their original forms. There's some fascinating music there, including a movement in E flat minor, which was an absolutely rare and unused key, of such drive, almost demonic drive, which we associate with a much later and more mature Beethoven. And these early works at the age of 14, there's definitely glimpses there of Beethoven, the true genius. But there are also differences between the passages in the early quartets and the places where he took these passages and used them in these three sonatas, opus 2. We find also passages in the sonata in C major. But here the difference is really fascinating. The beginning, to play it quickly, is basically the same. So this is the first half of the phrase. And then in the quartet, which he wrote at the age of 14, he once again goes. So he repeats bars 1 and 2, and then which is a nice, if slightly banal phrase. But listen to the small change in how it transforms the entire phrase. In the sonata, the second half of the phrase, this is true genius. This is the poetry of, instead of going again down, of striving upwards. This is really, really beautiful and poetic, and it transforms the entire phrase, because what was previously nice but perhaps not that inspired, this is the moment of true inspiration, like a moment of light which shines upon the entire phrase, and also on our mood as listeners, because the first movement is quite dark, and the beginning of the second movement, it could be just nice, pleasant music, but here we feel this is something more. This is something with so much soul and poetry in it. And then this idea of striving upwards, it continues. Trying to get as high as he can, floating in the stratosphere. And now the same phrase repeated at the highest reaches of the keyboard. Like heavenly music. Then there is a short middle section, which is in minor. It is written that there is an accompaniment in the middle voices. And there is a line high up and below, which is played both by the right hand. You might remember I told you about these doublings. This is not a very pianistic thing, it's more imagining either two violins, first and second violin in a string quartet, or woodwinds, flute and clarinet, flute and bassoon, oboe and bassoon. So this is more than just pianistic writing. And then something interesting textually. In all the old editions, the text went. But recent editions show that actually when you do an X-ray on the original score, it was written like that. So it went not to D, but to F, And later there was some kind of smudge which led to the score being read incorrectly by the copyist, which led to this mistake. But I think the F makes so much sense. We have D, then we have E, D, E, and then final F. Again, reinforcing this idea of striving upwards, which is a motif throughout this movement. And also, I find it much more beautiful in comparison to, which is nice, but a bit not as great, I would say. And then, after a transition, there is a full repeat of the opening, but with variations and passages and ornaments. So this is the same, but now it starts. So our beautiful three chords now have also a beautiful flowing accompaniment. And if chords have a slightly more impersonal feel, either orchestral or like in a choral texture, this being a single voice, I find that much more touching. And then the variations and ornaments go on and on, becoming more and more elaborate. Finally, it's a passage in 30-second notes triplet. This is towards the end. And once again, the very last bars, we have this idea of striving upwards. This time with a beautiful sforzando on this colorful note. Such a beautiful dissonant. Once again, these final chords, not very pianistic, but more orchestral, dense textures. Every single note played. An utterly beautiful second movement for the first sonata. Then we have the slightly unexpected minuetto. So normally, as I said, we would have gone to the finale after the slow movement in a sonata, but here he goes into a minuetto. This minuetto, at the beginning, we don't think that it is something extraordinary or Beethovenian. It's quite elegant and compacted. The first sign of something unexpected comes here, where without any kind of crescendo we have a subito forte and goes back to piano as if nothing happened. But then it continues still in piano, and imagine yourself as a listener hearing all that, and it kind of lulls you into a relaxed mood. There's a bit of pain here, but still nothing which prepares you for the fortissimo outburst which comes out of nowhere. And going back to piano. So first of all, this quite bare doubling, like octaves. And now this clash between the two hands. again with sforzandi on the weak beats. Quite hard, harsh harmonies. So this kind of two characters within one, whether it was Beethoven and someone else, or two personae within Beethoven himself. But once more, it for me is a step forward towards the finale, which we'll get to immediately, of something where he took a genre which was elegant in its core. Minuets were supposed to be the epitome of elegance, and he subverts it. He introduces there an element of a personal, emotional breakdown, outburst, which usually would not have space in a minuet genre, and yet he manages to find a way of integrating the two. And then the most Beethovenian of all movements, and an absolutely magnificent finale, the last fourth movement. It is prestissimo. We have this constant motion in triplet, like almost something neurotic, anxious, full of nerves bubbling under the surface, but it's bubbling under the surface just for a bit and then it immediately explodes. So it starts piano, and then immediately it's forte, then a little bit of something elegant, sforza, and then from here on it's all this kind of shadowy triplets. And if before it was piano and forte, now it's piano and fortissimo. You might remember I told you about him being at the edge of the keyboard, so this is the place. He has a chord on the B, on the D, and then on the F, which he repeats. And again, so this idea of him being unable to accept this limitation of the keyboard and using these extreme outbursts of chords to hammer at the edge and try to burst through. This is an unusual movement in that the second subject is still in the minor key. The kind of darkness which we also find in the Moonlight Sonata, where there's no contrasting second subject in a major key to alleviate the gloom. Here it's all unstable, full of anxiety, full of very conflicted, powerful emotions. Above these empty, we have a shadowy line descending. I find this wonderful. We have this distant rumble in the bass, without bursting forth, and then we have this quite reserved, empty octaves. And I love this in particular, like funeral horns from the distance. I find this very, very powerful. It's also, I think, in terms of performance, it's nice to treat these octaves not as one unit, but imagine two instruments moving in unison, which I think there's something quite orchestral also with this. You can imagine a tremolo in the cello basses, perhaps also timpani. It's very atmospheric. So to think of the lower voice as almost independent, here there's two lines moving together. And then after this shadowy passage, we once again have a full burst of emotion. And then this is really interesting in terms of structure. Here he would need to do something. So what is our structure? In fact, he writes a middle section as if it were a minuet or scherzo. That is a middle section which is not related at all to what we had before and which is then not repeated in the reprise. So we have a first section which is like an exposition, but the development doesn't develop anything from the exposition. It takes new material, contrasting material, and writes just that. Sempre piano e dolce, always soft and sweet. Once again, this striving upwards, trying to be as high as he can. So in a way, the function which the second subject is supposed to serve as a contrast to the main theme, here it is the middle section of the entire movement which functions as that contrast. And then it goes on, and then we have our transition back to what is effectively the reprise. Once again, octave doublings. And now our triplets come back. One thing which I forgot to mention, and I should, is that these are the last chords of the first movement. So, as I said, the second and third movement, they bring us closer to the finale, but in a way, there's also a feeling that he takes the last bit of the first movement, bridges over the second and third movement that are almost an entity of their own, and then he continues this line of darkness and passion in the finale. Though, as I mentioned in the Minuet, we did have something which links to the finale musically or in terms of mood. So the transition to the reprise. So we have phrases which are half and half. It is still not quite here nor there. There are two bars with already the tremolo, but then going back to the accompaniment of the middle section. This idea of going up to a note and repeats it again and again and again. And then we finally go back to the reprise. Not immediately, but we have another small transition. Strong accents and a sforzando on the offbeat. And exactly like in the first movement, the reprise starts already forte. So if you remember at the beginning of the finale, started piano, and only here it burst out. But here, after a decrescendo, a diminuendo to pianissimo, it blazes out. And then we have the reprise, which repeats everything in the exposition, including the final passages. And then something really interesting. He offers us the option of going back to the middle section. That is, going back to here. And this was usual in earlier times, when in a sonata form, both the exposition and the development and reprise would be repeated. But by that time, the exposition repeat was common and remained common throughout Beethoven's life. He sometimes omits it, but even in his last sonata, Opus 111, many decades later, he still repeats the exposition. But the second repeat, the repeat of the development and the reprise, that was a lot less common. Why? Because once we get to the end of the reprise, so much has happened that to go back to the development, it is a bit like trying to retread the same path, and it doesn't really work in storytelling terms. But I would like to make a case for observing this repeat just in this sonata, because the middle section is the only moment of light we have in this movement. As you remember, everything else is dark. In terms of storytelling, then, what it could be that we have this collapse here. So it is defeat, it has gone badly, we didn't succeed. But then we try again, against all hope, we try again to rise from this darkness. And it opens up a lot of interpretative possibilities. If at first this theme could be just beautiful the first time we encountered, singing, almost operatic, quite projecting. The second time, if we do play it for the second time, it could be much more fragile, personal, intimate, something that you hold very close to your heart and try to protect. And then, as it goes on, it might gather some life and strength. So of course this is an open question and each one of us addresses it differently, but I feel, especially in view of the compactness and shortness of this wonderful sonata, it is worth to give this melody in major a second chance, presented in a different way to the audience, and also it will give us another go at the amazing material of the reprise, which is really wonderful to play.